Okay, everybody, welcome. Good to have everybody back. I hope you had a great Pesach. And let's get to work. We're right in the middle of a very, very busy time of the year, as we know. These modern Jewish holidays, thank God, since the creation of the state, we've been able to institute 4 new special days. I think we're all familiar with them: Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, and Yom Yerushalayim. So we're really right in the middle, exactly in the middle of that period of these 4 new commemorative days. So I want to talk about a very fascinating medrash in our Sedra of Tazria Mitzorah. You probably know the pasuk. Everybody asks, what can you talk about in Tazria Mitzorah? It's talking about leprosy and talking about purity, impurity, but hidden within this parsha is a pasuk and a commentary. It's very, very apropos to these days, and you probably know it well. It deals with this section in Mitzorah where the Kohen is called in. The Kohen then was really a spiritual leader in every way, a kind of spiritual doctor. He's called in because someone's home is afflicted with tzarat. Again, without getting into the nature of tzarat, I think we may have talked about that. It's not so much a physical ailment. It is a physical caused by a spiritual, some type of disconnect that causes this spiritual disconnect, spiritual defect that causes the physical defect to appear. In any case, it comes into the home. And the pasuk tells us that, first of all, it only occurs in Eretz Yisrael. Ki tavo el Eretz Canaan starts the pasuk, and you find a neged tzarat in the house. And there's a process whereby ultimately, in the worst case scenario, the house will be dismantled. And here Rashi brings the famous medrash from Vayikra Rabbah and says, you look at this as being a very negative and very traumatic incident, but says Rashi, it really isn't. Besora hi lahem. It's actually good news. Why, says Rashi? Shahanegiim ba'im alehem lefi sheitminu amoraim matmoniot shel zahav b'kirot batehem. That the Amorites, during the 40 years the Jews were traveling through the desert, hearing about what had happened at Kriyat Yamsuf, at the splitting of the sea, fearing that they would not only be invaded, but be conquered. So they took to hiding their valuables, primarily gold, within the walls of their house. And if the house was taken, they wouldn't find the gold, they could come back for it. But when this tzarat strikes the house, so it'll dismantle this. Some say the whole house, some say just the portion actually where these valuables are hidden. And then, lo and behold, there's gold in their walls. And therefore, the Rashi says it's actually good news. Well, this obviously raises a great deal of questions. The main one being that why does one have to go through the trauma of seeing his or her possessions they have to remove the possessions from the house. They have to dismantle the house. It's obviously very, very difficult. They, of course, don't know at that point what's hidden in the walls, but to see their home, even though it's the home they inherited, that was previously built by somebody else, it wasn't built by them. Now they see it in shambles, and then suddenly they find this treasure. Why would they have had to endure this ordeal? Why didn't Hashem somehow reveal that the gold was in the walls, reveal the treasure without the trauma? That's the real sticking point here. If God wanted someone to have that wealth, why did they have to go through this trauma in order to get there? There are 2 classic answers given to this question. The first one is that, well, this person, of course, because they were stricken with tzaraat, clearly had certain very grievous faults. And rather than afflict the person and have the person go through a personal physical ordeal, God is going to, in a sense, take out the punishment on the house, on the bricks and the stones, the inanimate objects, rather than on the person. This is a similar idea we talk about with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, that Hashem allowed the Jewish people to survive and took out the fury that he had and the anger on the Beit HaMikdash. But I want to look a little bit deeper into this idea and try to understand it before I go on to the second response and second approach to this question. So there's a very famous and beautiful midrash that I want to share. Some of you may know it. It's one of my favorite midrashim. And it's the story of a man who wanted to learn how to speak the language of the birds. And kind of an unusual request, but he loved the birds. He wanted to be able, in a sense, to converse or at least understand what they were saying. And he came to Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo is the wisest of all people, and said to him, Shlomo, teach me the language of the birds. By tradition, we say that just like Adam could speak the language of the animal kingdom, Shlomo HaMelech also was able to somehow communicate with also the birds, the animals. And so he said, teach me how to understand the language of the birds. And Shlomo said, no, I won't. And the man said, well, why won't you? He says, I don't think you should learn the language of the birds. Speak your own language and leave the rest alone. But the man persisted and insisted until Shlomo said, all right, I'm not in favor of it, but I'll teach you. So he taught him the language of the birds. And one day the man was in his house and two birds came by and they perched on his windowsill. And one said to the other, did you see the fire that's going on out there in the field? And the man overheard what the birds were saying. He quickly rushed out to the field, and sure enough, there was a fire that was beginning to burn down his field. He quickly brought water, put out the fire, and basically nothing happened to his field. He went to Shlomo and he said, you see how wonderful it is? I learned the language of the birds, and it was a good thing that you taught me. And Shlomo said, we'll see. Well, some time passed, and the man was then out in his field, tilling the field, and two birds came by and were perched on a tree in the field. And he heard one of the birds say to the other, did you see the fire that's starting in the house over there? And the man heard this and he saw it was his house. He rushed back to his house and got water, put out the fire, and came to Shlomo and said, again, you see how advantageous and beneficial it was that I learned the language of the birds. And Shlomo said, we'll see. Some time passed, and then again, the man was walking and two birds came and flew and landed near him where he was walking. And he heard one of the birds say to the other, oh, you see this man? He's going to die tomorrow. Well, he was obviously shaken up, and he ran to Shlomo and he said to him, what do I do? I heard the birds saying that something terrible was going to happen to me. And Shlomo said to him, I told you, it's not right for you to learn the language of the birds, because don't you understand what happened? You obviously, unfortunately, have done certain things where you deserve a punishment. But Hashem was going to inflict that punishment on your field and said, that'll be enough. We destroy the field. It's punishment enough for you. But you learned about it in a kind of supernatural way, and you prevented that from happening. So next Hashem said, all right, then we'll take it out on the house. But you didn't let that happen either. because you heard what the birds were saying. And now that Hashem wasn't able to take out that punishment on the field of the house, now unfortunately it's going to be taken out on you. Had you not stopped the birds, had you not stopped the field and the house from burning, after hearing what the birds said, then you would be safe today. So the lesson, of course, of that story is that things, negative things, at least in our perception, do happen. But are they totally, absolutely negative? Not necessarily. And in the end of the day, what seems to be a negative may actually turn out to be a positive. The klala can turn into a bracha. But at some point, Hashem is going to have his way. So in this story of the house, the person did deserve a certain amount of trauma and a certain amount of sadness as to what happened. But at the end of the day, it really was all to his benefit when he found the gold. So that's story number one, or lesson number one. The second idea of this midrash, something behind it, is that we look at events, but very difficult for us to connect all the dots. And we see sometimes we can't always look at things on a spiritual level, but more on a scientific level. That is, we have to see what happens in the world and follow the events that take place. That we can know, but why it happens, we don't know. But the facts are that liberation follows slavery, healing follows sickness, peace follows war, life eternal follows death. That just is the pattern, and that is the progression that exists. We saw this in the in last week's Parsha of Shmini, in the story of the death of Nadav and Avihu, with, I would suggest, the most mysterious, oblique statement in all of Tanakh, when Moshe says to Aaron, not necessarily trying to console him, but more or less stating a fact, and says to him, I knew that the Mishkan would have to be sanctified through someone's death, said Moshe, but I thought it would be me or you. I didn't know it would be your sons. They apparently are even more holy than we are. Bikravai ekadesh, says God. Through those who are closest to me, I will be sanctified. And we ask the question, why? Why should someone have to die in order for the Mishkan to be built? We don't have an answer. No one's ever provided an answer. I've talked about this pasuk with many, many rabbanim, many very wise people, and they will shrug their shoulders and say, we don't know. But that's the way it is. And for better or worse, that's the pattern and that's the progression that we see. First comes the darkness and then the dawn. And there is a whole discussion about Nadav and Avihu, that they receive a tremendous schar in Olam Haba. And again, no one can look at that and say, oh, well, then it must be worth it if that's what ultimately their reward is. This is something that's completely and totally out of our hands. So as I say, we only can look at what occurs in life and through Jewish history and understand that the greatest moments in Jewish history are almost always, almost immediately following some great tragedy. And we have a liberation from Egypt, but we have to suffer through 117 years of slavery. The Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. The Jewish people are dispersed. Nevertheless, we're able to build great communities throughout the diaspora. And of course, in our own generation, we see that the Holocaust is followed by the Hakamat HaMedina, the formation of, after 2,000 years, of Am Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. Is it worth it? Is it fair to say that we needed the Holocaust in order to have an Israel, that that makes it okay? No, nobody is saying that. What we're just doing is looking at it scientifically and saying, this is the pattern of Jewish history. We read on Pesach, and it's always very appropriate, although we read it on the other, on Chol HaMoed Sukkot as well, this very mysterious story of Moshe saying to God, I want to understand, where is justice in the world? He says, Hareini nat kevodecha, show me your glory, which means show me how you work, how you operate. Why do you, a just, merciful, all-powerful God, preside over so much suffering? And basically, if you know the story that's in Parshat Kitisa, and it's very difficult to understand, that the pasuk says that God puts Moshe in the palm of his hand, he covers him, and he puts him in the cleft of the rock, and he says to him that my glory will pass over you, and then you will understand. And he says, Ra'it et achorai, you will see my back, ufanai lo yera, but you won't see my face. Does God have a back? Does God have a face? No. But the deeper meaning of all this is, you can't see something in real time and understand it. And real time might not be minute for minute. It might be over a period of years. But even though you can't see it in real time, ra'it et achorai, if you look at it from the back, in other words, with perspective, and you look back with enough perspective, you will begin to understand and have a completely different viewpoint. So the slaves who went through Abdut Mitzrayim, all the torture of slavery, no, they couldn't see it. They were in it. But later on, when we have 1,000, 2,000 years of perspective, we look back at the saga of the Exodus, we sit at the Seder, and we're quite happy. We're quite jovial, we're singing, we're making 4 toasts, we're eating the fantastic, maybe the best meal of the year, with only a small amount of attention paid to the slavery. Most of it is uplifting and is positive. And you ask yourself, how can you be positive about something that was so tragic? So many people died. Rashi says that 80% of the Jews did not make it out of Egypt. That's a Holocaust. That's the same percentage, essentially, of the Jews of Europe who were killed in the Holocaust. And that's what Moshe wanted to understand. And God said, you can't understand it now. Later on, maybe. And that's why we can sit at the Seder and we can devote a little bit of time to the Maror and talking about the Abdut. But 90% or more of the Seder is very uplifting and happy. And it's not like we're insensitive to what happened, but we see the whole picture, at least a much bigger picture. We don't only see the slavery, we see the liberation, we see coming to Har Sinai and getting the Torah, we see entering Eretz Yisrael, we see the miracles. It's a whole different picture. And as opposed to seeing it through a keyhole, you're seeing a much larger tapestry, and now you have a completely different picture. So I suggest that this is also one of the lessons of this medrash, this very potent medrash, that's telling us you can't judge the situation the moment you're standing in it. But after all is said and done, you don't only see the breaking down of the walls, you also see the gold. So here we are. We have Yom HaShoah and we have Yom HaZikaron. These are very sad and traumatic days. But at the same time, we have Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim. And I suggest that Hashem is already developing that perspective so that when we look back, it doesn't mean we will ignore what happened in the Holocaust or what happened to anyone who fell in battle or victims of terror. They're all deserving of our respect and obviously semi-mourning or real mourning for them. But there's a bigger picture. And that, I think, is what Moshe was trying to tell Aaron. I don't understand why this had to happen this way. That's the way God works. And it's one of those things that's inscrutable. If we knew why it happens, then we'd be sitting up there and God would be sitting down here. But as it is, there are certain things that we mortals are limited and cannot see in full perspective. But there is a certain amount of emunah that at the end of the day, it will, with all the trauma, it'll work out okay. It'll work out to our benefit. Maybe it was something that had to happen. Who can say? I remember that in the yeshiva, there was a letter that was passed around. One of the Rabbanim in our yeshiva in Skokie, Rabbi Moshe Meiselman. Actually, it was a mathematician, very, really is a genius. Today, he runs a very popular Haredi yeshiva in Yerushalayim. And he passed around or sent around to the students a paper explaining what his take on the Holocaust, why he thought the Holocaust occurred. I'm not going to get into it. It deals with the whole repetition of the word carry in the Tochacha, in the curses, and talking about people not giving proper respect to the Torah, etc. It's sometime maybe we'll go into that because it's a fascinating approach. But he almost immediately received a reproach from his uncle, Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, who said to his nephew, don't ever do that again. You cannot know or hope to know why the Holocaust happened. And it's not for you to know. It's something that is beyond the scope of human reasoning and intellect to try to reconcile the Holocaust with our concept of, again, Teil Rachum V'Chanun, a just and merciful, all-powerful God. But again, and he, in a sense, retracted the letter, although it was a little bit late because everybody had it already. But the point is, those days, those tragic events in Jewish life do not send a message that there is no God or that we are destined for destruction. We don't know exactly why it happens that way, but we know that it does happen that way, that trauma is always followed by treasure or by these very positive, almost miraculous events. And that allows us somehow to get through the difficult days, these sad and very almost paralyzing days when so much suffering and so much death occurred. But we take that in, and in a sense, almost like our own, with the understanding that we're not privy to see the entire picture. So I want to suggest that this is part and parcel not only of past history, but we are reliving our history here in Israel, because we are seeing the highs and the lows, or I would say the lows and the highs of the Jewish experience in the world. And again, the hope is that with perspective, in the course of time, we will view everything in a slightly different light, as Moshe was taught, and perhaps as all of us do vis-a-vis what happened in Egypt, that there will be a happy ending that will cast a completely different light on everything that we've seen before. So Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. If you have a comment in the next 5 minutes or so, unmute yourself and feel free if you have something brief to say or question. Okay. If I don't hear anything else, then I'll assume that everybody has taken some time to think about this. Have a Shabbat Shalom to everybody, and we'll see you again next week.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.